and said you were a planning student or had taken a course in introductory planning. And I wouldn't like to be embarrassed to know that you couldn't respond to questions. Hey, remember we started off talking about history. The history and some highlights of the history of urban planning in the United States. I gave you this piece of paper. Hopefully you still have it with you. Remember we started all the way back there in 1682 with William Penn. And made mention of the fact that William Penn laid out the city of Philadelphia using actually the gridiron pattern for the streets. The reason that this is important is because everybody imitated it, and so most of your cities, at least practically all of them, east of the Mississippi, and most of them between there and California, were developed with the old gridiron street pattern. The reasons for this is it was the simplest system, made it easy to describe and measure property. It was safe for the intersections for the vehicles and the pedestrians, and with the engineering of the day, considered to be the best. And it's only not really until you get to California do you come across the old curvilinear street patterns dominating entire cities. You generally find the gridiron street pattern. Okay, the next thing we talked about was Williamsburg, Virginia, which was planned by Francis Nicholson, who was the governor of Virginia. And in Williamsburg, remember, you have the broad boulevard linking three monuments together. The College of William and Mary, the House of Burgess, and the Governor's Mansion. And why is this important? Well, it was one of the first of the monumental cities in America, and being that folks spent a lot of money to restore it, is a place that a lot of people have visited and know of as the monumental city. And then you as the planner can tell them that the rest of the cities, such as Washington, D.C., even Detroit, the Monument Circle in Indianapolis, Indiana, and ad infinitum, these were examples of where architects or planners attempted to duplicate the monumental city pattern in various cities of America, with Williamsburg being one of the first. And then we went on to say how Washington, D.C. was planned by Mr. Pierre Lafont, a French architect, planner, used the system of diagonal and radial streets superimposed upon the gridiron pattern and brought together elements of both. A functional gridiron street pattern and the aspects of the monumental city. And indeed, all of you should be very proud of your capital city, while folks in Europe and the rest of the world claim to be older and have their grandiose capital cities. The city of Washington, D.C. does not take a back seat to any of them. Particularly if you're going to show it to somebody, take them there at night first. It looks much better at night under the lights than take them back the next day in the daylight. And then we went on to talk about Detroit, Michigan, and other cities in America planned in this grand tradition. We then talked about the development of the green strips and green belts in England. Remember, this was an idea that started in England, and then we brought it to America during the days of the economic depression in the 30s. It's important to you because you have an example of it just about 10 miles due north of here in the city of Green Hills. And there's an idea that is cherished by Americans. And most anybody who tries to come up with a planned community gently tries to incorporate some of that green belt, green strip kind of aspect with the community. And it boiled down to the individual American wanted that little plot of green in the backyard. Then we talked about the little town of Riverside, Illinois, being first laid out as a suburban community, which today is encompassed totally within Chicago. And this was the beginning of the idea of the move to the suburbs. Took place in 1870. So the 1950s, post-World War II, the move to the suburbs was not a brand new idea, and that's why it's important to you to know hardly any of these things are new ideas, but they're an old idea that has been reworked. So don't always try to reinvent the wheel if you're faced with an urban design problem of a particular type. Look what's already been tried before in other places. It may give you some good ideas. Okay, then we talked about the Columbian Exhibition of 1893 with Frederick Olmsted, Daniel Burnham, and John Root. Where they painted it white, whitewashed it, and put lights on it. And from this, Daniel made his famous expression, is do not make the little plans, they do not stir the hearts of men. And that started the planning movement in America along on the idea of grand master or comprehensive planning. Then we talked about Burnham's plan that he did for Chicago, and we talked about the City Beautiful doctrine. Then we talked about the first comprehensive zoning ordinance in New York City. Alfred Bettman, the Cincinnati attorney, was instrumental in its adoption. He then went on to publish the model zoning code that was copied all over the country. He hung around in Cincinnati, became the chairperson of the Planning Commission, was instrumental in adopting the first master plan. So as students of the University of Cincinnati, it should be important to you to know the little bit of history of the planning profession indigenous to the city of Cincinnati. Alfred Bettman, who authored the first zoning ordinance and is the father of the whole zoning movement, and then the fact that the first master plan was adopted by the City Planning Commission in Cincinnati. We then went on to talk about the new town of Radburn, New Jersey, new town idea separating vehicular and pedestrian traffic, and it opened the day that the stock market crash came, so it lounged in inactivity until we not only came back from the economic depression, but had finished the Second World War, and is now the home of the affluent. And that lesson for us is that every planned community since that day that has always been touted to be homes for working men wind up in the hands of the affluent folks because they're so desirable. And going back to the law of supply and demand, there's always a great demand for good-looking housing. Remember that location, location, and location. And so anything that is planned uniquely will be in short supply, and so therefore winds up in the hands of the people with the demand, the bucks, or the affluent type of people. We then talked about how during the days of the 30s, during the economic depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt created various kinds of projects, one of which were the Greenbelt towns of Green Hills, Ohio, Greenbelt, Maryland, and Greendale, Wisconsin. He also brought about public housing and all these ideas to get the economy in America moving again. It got it started, and then World War II happened and kept it moving. And then in 1946, the war is over. We now have a real shortage of housing. We got lots of new families formed during the war. The economy is going full tilt. Everybody's got lots of money. They're standing in line waiting to buy automobiles and housing and everything. And the mayors of the big cities are talking to Congress about the problems they have with the slums in their town. So we passed the Urban Renewal Program after first experimenting with the first Urban Renewal Project, which is the Golden Triangle Project in Pittsburgh, where the Allegheny and Monongahela meet to form the Ohio River. There's a triangle of land, totally cleared, just like was the west end of Cincinnati, restored as a public park, office buildings and hotels covered with anodized aluminum. When the sun sets in the west, it shines on these buildings and that triangle of land becomes golden. It resulted in the movement of all the black and poor white folks to the North Shore, across the Allegheny River, the north side, created a new slum, which it did in every other city that urban renewal was tried. A few years later, they built their Three River Stadium there and removed the people the second time further to the north. And they, like every other major city in the country, are still faced with slums and economically depressed area. And we now have found out that urban renewal will not solve the problem. You can't get rid of people who are poor just by tearing down the slum housing. You push them somewhere else and they create a new slum overnight. We've been wrestling with the problem ever since, but have gotten no further in the solution thereof. Next, we talked about the new town of Levittown being built overnight, how Mr. Levitt mass-produced housing like Henry Ford mass-produced automobiles. And at first that was accepted because we really needed the housing. Later on, this style of housing called, prefab, became a dirty word. And we still are living today with people thinking that they live in, custom homes, which are still really partially prefab and trucked to the site. But the folks who live in this kind of housing still look down upon the people who live in prefabs, modular, mobile, or any other kind of words you want to use for pre-manufactured housing. It's generally as much welcome in towns as our apartments and college dormitories. So we all know where that fits. Okay, then we discovered about 1948 that the regional shopping center had come about and was destroying the neighborhood business districts. And so about 1949, we passed the National Housing Act. And you all ought to remember what the National Housing Act of 1949 is. It is the major piece of federal legislation in the field of housing and planning. And all new planning and housing laws are enacted as amendments thereto. So for a planner, the 1949 Housing Act is your major piece of legislation that is enacted or is, amended each and every time that the U.S. Congress acts. In 1954, major amendments to this 49 Housing Act were adopted, including 701 Comprehensive Planning Assistance Program. And why should this be of interest to you? Because Section 701 is that part of the law that really gave rise to the planning profession in America. It called for, planning activities to be done or accomplished by every local unit of government and provided monies for this to take place. Being there was the money, there were the jobs. Being there were the jobs, it created a market for planners. This market for planners led the universities to creating planning programs to provide the supply for this demand. So Section 701 can be tied directly into the reason for this School of Planning and the undergraduate degree Baccalaureate of Urban Planning and the Master of Community Planning graduate degrees to be in existence. Without 701, we don't know if it ever would have happened or not. It may have, some other way, but being they enacted Section 701 to the Housing Act, that created the demand, which we supplied. Okay, we then talked about how the urban renewal programs grew and changed under each succeeding federal administration, under John Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson. You had the New Frontiers program, you had the Pilot Cities program and the Model Cities program and the Neighborhood Development program, all which came trying to solve this problem of deterioration of the cities, physical deterioration, that is, of the housing stock and buildings, all of which gave us a little bit of help, none of which solved the overall problem. And by 1970, we got tired of them all. And in 1970, under Nixon's administration, we began the National Environmental Protection Act, which we still have with us today, although do not pay much attention to it. But we switched from the war on poverty to the war on pollution. We then moved on and got rid of all these categorical programs from the urban renewal days and moved to a block grant program of general and special revenue sharing. This continued for a number of years and is expiring at the present time. So we moved on through President Carter, who promised an urban policy but never gave it to us. And under President Reagan's administration, he vowed to get out of the domestic assistance business, has been rather persistent about that. And so today, we have basically two programs, the Community Development Block Grant and the Urban Development Action Grants. Those two programs are the only thing left where that planners are fooling around with the federal government and obtaining monies from the feds to do any kind of planning and or development. So we went through a cycle from about the end of the Second World War to about 1988 and have gone full circle to where we're back to where we were at the end of the war. Sir?
Can you explain the community development block grant?
Yes, sir. Community development block grant today is what is left of all grants, sewer grants, all of them. Some of the things that you should remember about the history of planning coming into America and the way that the federal involvement waxed and waned. I'm not sure I even mentioned this in class, but this is something else that you want to know about the history of planning, and that is the history of its professional organization. So you need to write this down if I haven't given it to you already. And that is the year 1917 in Kansas City. A group of engineers, architects, landscape architects who had been engaged in planning in America met and formed a professional organization that they first named, they had one name but only lasted for a year, but the first real name was the American Institute of Planners. Or AIP. And for a long time, if you wanted to be recognized as a professional planner, you joined the American Institute of Planners. You took a test, and you had to have a master's degree in 2 years of experience, or a bachelor's degree in 4 years of experience, or a college degree in an allied field and 5 years of experience. And after you had gained that, you could pass an examination, and then you would be considered a full member of AIP, and we're privileged to put AIP after your name. And then people would know that you're a professional planner. After this was in existence for a number of years, there was another organization that arose called the American Society of Planning Officials, or ASPO. And anybody could join ASPO for $15 a year. You didn't have to have any degrees, any experience, or anything else. What it was meant to be was an organization for the citizen members of planning commissions. Remember how we appoint people to serve on the planning commissions? Okay, well, this was an idea they had to publish books and a monthly newsletter to try to educate these people, because they were appointed to planning commissions and generally knew nothing about it, and they were really oriented towards zoning. And so their newsletter, would tell you the latest things in zoning matters, so that these members of the planning commissions could understand that. Okay, ASPO being it only cost $15, most planners who belong to AIP also belong to ASPO. And then ASPO was the first one to start publishing the Jobs in Planning magazine, which the students used to carry around like the Bible. And so we had that going. And it was at 1313 East 60th Street in Chicago. AIP was always in Washington, D.C. And then we came up with a third organization called the Collegiate Schools of Planning, American Collegiate Schools of Planning, ACSP. And that was just for us professors. So all professors of planning belong to ASCP, the Collegiate Schools of Planning. And these three organizations sort of coexisted for a number of years. AIP being the professional, ASPO being the citizen, and Collegiate Schools of Planning being the educators. And after a while, things began to happen. One of which was the AIP published a journal. The Journal of Planning. Okay. And most of the people who wrote articles for the journal were the educators. Because you've all heard the publish or perish bit, that's for real. You join the faculty as a young instructor, and if you want to make, like assistant professor, you've got to publish so many articles each year, etc., etc. So the journal provided the place for young, members of planning faculties to get their articles published. Okay, educators don't generally write articles that talk about practical how to do things. They talk about the theory of the political economy model analysis of organizational structure, resulting in the satisfaction of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that gets you about 150 points from your dean, but the planner in City Hall just says, huh? And pays no attention to it. So the AIP membership said, why don't you publish articles that'll help me run my shop tomorrow? And they said, okay, somebody write them. And the faculty kept on writing them and kept on producing the articles about theory to finally ask the Association of the Collegiate Schools of Planning said, why don't you let us publish the journal? So nowadays the journal JAP, the Journal of American Planning, is published, or so it's JAPA, is published by these folks. And so AIP got out of the business. And when they did, they sort of lost something. At the same time, ASPO has probably got 100 times the membership of AIP. And there was also a little power, you don't have to write all this down, a little power play in here. Stolman was the actor that it all started in 1917 in Kansas City, and they created the American Institute of Planners, which then later on merged with the American Society of Planning Officials, and so today is called the American Planning Association. And if you want to state that it has as its subsidiary the American Institute of Certified Planners, which is the closest thing to professional planning recognition possible, feel perfectly free to do so. Okay, then after talking about the history, following the outline of the book, we then got into some of the planning theories. And so you should know the basic planning theories and be able to briefly describe them. And of course, the first one we would talk about is actually the rationalism, the rational planning model, or rationalism, which means that we devise a plan on a purely rational basis. We look at our city, we project the population and the economic activity into the future. We take the goals of the community into account, what people want. They want a single-family home at the end of a cul-de-sac that is no longer than 600 feet, that enters directly onto an interstate highway ramp with a traffic light to stop all opposing traffic, and no one ever passes their house during the day. They have low taxes, good schools, and all the good things America has to offer. And then, knowing all this, you draw up a rational plan. And that is what that rationalism is. The second style is referred to as incrementalism. Incrementalism. We move along one increment at a time. You've got a problem today, okay, we'll solve that problem tomorrow. And then we'll see what problem comes up the next day. Most people refer to this as the process of muddling through. Somehow or the other, we will always solve the problem. It is reactionary rather than being, proactive. At least in the rational planning model, you look toward the future. You come up with an end state in view. You generally look 20 to 25 years down the road and plan for what kind of a city. You have goals and objectives that you try to reach. That's the rational way to plan. Incremental way to plan is we solve whatever problem comes up. And then we live day to day. Incrementalism. Okay, the third theory that a lot of people subscribed to was the utopianism, where we draw up a plan to reach some higher state, the nirvana, heaven on earth, utopia. There have been lots of utopian schemes proposed for America. Remember I told you that you can go Pleasant Hill of Kentucky, 56 miles southwest of Lexington, commonly referred to as Shakertown. That was a utopian scheme. It was going to be heaven on earth. People lived off the land, lived for the land, took care of themselves, rejoiced in the fact that they were trying to avoid sin, avoid the outside world, and were living their good society where hard work was rewarded, and in the process they had a physical plan for their community. They had the East House, the Center House, and the West House. Each house had the wash house, was adjacent to it. Then they had the meeting house, and all of the houses had a prescribed distances for them. Each of them had 2 doors because they believed in complete separation of the sexes. So women used one door, men used the other. The hallways were wide enough so that men and women passing down the hallways would never have to touch each other. The hallways were, really 3 times this wide. So people could walk down the hallway and you would never be forced to touch anyone of the opposite sex. So all of these utopian plans that we came up with, all of them, for some reason or the other, had a physical, manifestation of the idea of utopia here on earth. And it's still a good theory. All of us would like that utopia. When I describe what the average American wants, that's 1988 utopia. That little piece of property that is yours, completely private, and nobody bothers you, but it is the easiest way to get around, hooray for me and the hell with the rest of the world approach. But that's personal utopia. And so people still do think in these terms, and it is a valid theory. However, we've never been able to pull one off entirely. So you have rationalism, incrementalism, utopianism, and the fourth one is actually the Methodism. And here is where we plan for the sake of planning. We may not even know when we start what it is we're planning, but let's go ahead and make the plans. Somebody will have use for them sometime. We gather the data, and this is not only a theory, but this is being practiced daily. Every year, or every 10 years, when the Census Bureau, counts the census, there are thousands of people waiting in line to break down their door to convince them to ask another question on the census, because they want more data. And the planning commissions of America gather data daily. If any of you go to City Hall, the PAMS operation on the first floor, you have Dick Moran. Dick has got more, computer tapes and more maps and more loose-leaf notebooks than anyone I've ever met. And if there's anything you want to know about Cincinnati, he's got a number for it. And he just collects data ad infinitum. Someday somebody will use it to do some kind of plan, and it's not a bad idea. In fact, I don't know what year it was, but I was the one who came up with the idea for PAMS and did the original feasibility study. Came out of me, Herb Stevens, and I met at an APA meeting in Detroit. And we were looking at all the nice displays of all the master plans. And we were commenting on the fact that everybody still does the same old thing, got to do something different. And so we came up with the idea of the PAM system. We first called it the Planning Guidance System. And it really was to gather all the planning everybody does, and then to display it, and then find where the holes in it were, and have the city planning staff do that as their annual chore, and then we would have a total plan. And then one part of it became that library where we would gather all the planning done, and we would, catalog it so that you could get at it and use it. And everybody likes data, and so that part of it, they really jumped on and kept. The rest of the idea is pretty well down the tubes now, but they still have the PAM's library. And so that is part of this Methodism theory. You come up with a method, and you go through the method. And that was part of the master plan. You were to prepare it looking forward about 25 years, and then you were to update it. And so we had the method for updating the master plan. Remember the population study, economic study, transportation study, land use study. Okay, so every year you update the land use map. That's part of Methodism. Planning for the sake of planning. Okay, so those are the four, and they're totally described in your book, so you shouldn't have any difficulty with that. And then we started talking about that planning is future-oriented, and so there are two terms which I want you to remember, so that whenever you read something else, you'll know what you're reading, or if you're the author, you tell your audience, and that is forecast and projection. And projection is just that. You project into the future on basis of today. You make no changes, no assumptions, nothing else. You just project what's happening today on into the future. If your population of your community increased by 10% last year, you say it's going to increase by 10% each and every year from now on. And you draw that straight line on your chart till it goes out the roof. That's projecting. The same thing that's happened today will happen tomorrow at the same rate. And in contrast to a projection, you can make a forecast. And that is where you make assumptions about one or more variables. So, projection or a forecast. When you're looking at a future population study, you need to know what it is. If it's a projection, you know what it is. If it's a forecast, then you want to know what assumptions were made about what variables to see if you agree with it or not. Here in Cincinnati, during the Second World War, we brought all the men from Southern Appalachian migrants from Eastern Kentucky to Cincinnati to induct them into the Army. And they would flunk the test, mainly because of black lung and tuberculosis. So we didn't take them in the Army, but we put them to work in all the defense factories in Cincinnati. And they brought their cousins and nephews and everybody else along because it was more money they ever saw in their lives. And so we had a great in-migration of Southern Appalachian migrants into Cincinnati between 1940 and 1950. And so the population folks saw this in-migration. And so they began to project Cincinnati's population into the future. And it went in a straight line, straight up. And the Chamber of Commerce adopted the slogan, "Area on the Move," with the fountain from Fountain Square with the arrow pointing at a 45-degree upward. And everybody believed all these projections. War ended in 1945. The defense factories closed down. All the soldiers and sailors came home. The system. So you ought to be able to define what is a system. And we have that for you in your book. Under the, I think it's the qualitative analysis section. So anyhow, we talked about systems. Yeah, there it is. Page 48, 46, page 44. Theories of system operation, general systems theory. Okay, so remember a system. A system is composed of parts operating somewhat within a boundary. So you got parts operating inside of a system, and the system is bounded and is somewhat influenced by its outside and the environment. And remember, we used the example of the automobile. You know, you can look at an automobile and it's got that, you know, the sheet metal body wrapped around it, but you can see where it starts and where it ends. And it's a system. It can operate in its external environment, but it always stays together, well, most of the time, as a car. And then it has its subsystems, its parts. It has an electrical system. It has a fuel system. It has a steering system. It has a braking system. And all of these work together to allow you to start it, operate it, turn it, stop it. And then, of course, it has the system for creature comforts with the doors to get in and out, the windows to let in air, the seats to sit on, the ashtrays to fill up, the radio, and nowadays, of course, tape players and 16 speakers to keep you amused while you're in it. All of those are subsystems of the total system. And you can look at a city the same way. A city has its housing system. It has its street system. It has a water system, a sanitary sewer system, a political system, an economic system. They're all parts that work within the city. City's got its boundary, its political line drawn on a map. However, it works with the outside environment. You know, people move in, people move out. Goods and services come in and go out. Money comes in and goes out. Okay, so that's a system. Okay, then you should also be able to describe a feedback system. And a feedback system is one that provides you with information of how it's operating. Your bank account's a good feedback system. You put money into it, you write checks on the account, and then bingo, once a month the bank sends you a statement that tells you if your system is still healthy or whether it is really in bad need of a new infusion of dollars. So any kind of a system, our registration system, you register for classes and they give you the little schedule bill and you pay your money and then you come to class and then 12 weeks later they send you a piece of paper with the bad news that says you either wasted your money or you got your good grades. Okay, so systems that operate and provide information is feedback. And then there's a particular kind of feedback systems, which we want you to learn this cute word, homeostasis. Homeostasis is that kind of a system, a kind of a feedback system that is self-controlling. And the human body is it's homeostasis. And, you know, your body is a system. We take in air, oxygen, and we breathe out the carbon dioxide. And then we have a brain that allows us to think. And we have a cardiovascular system that circulates the oxygen through the blood to all parts of the body. And the body is a self-regulating system. If everything in it is working correctly, you know, we are conscious, we are wide awake, and we can think, and we can move our muscles, and we can act. And if something goes wrong, we get feedback, pain. And when our body sends us pain, it is giving us the feedback and saying there's something wrong with you. But as long as then we take, you know, some aspirin, or we go to the doctor and get some medication, or we go to bed and stay there for 2 days, whatever, the body will repair itself and self-regulatory. And even if it isn't giving us any feedback, all we have to do is pop that little thermometer in our mouth and see if it reads 98.6. If it does, we are normal. If it reads above or below that, we know the system is out of kilter. But everything taken even, the body will maintain its system. The other one is easiest to understand is the central heating system in a home or a building, where we have a furnace connected with the thermostat. And when the furnace is on, it is generating heat. And when heat hits the metallic strip in the thermostat, it bends it, breaking the circuit, and turns the furnace off. When the furnace is off and the air cools, the metallic strip straightens itself out, closes at electric contact, and turns the furnace back on. That way you can set your thermostat to the 68 or 70 or 72 degrees, and the house will maintain itself. That is a state of homeostasis, a self-controlling system. And so if we ever came up with a perfect city, we would have reached the state of homeostasis. Its population would not fluctuate, its economy wouldn't fluctuate. We would just be in a nice, level, plain, the easy life. We know that that occurs only rarely. And most of the time you either have to grow or you will decline. Okay. Then we started talking about if you're going to plan for a community, you must pay for the community. And so every town needs a budget. And so we talked about different types of budgets. And so the first major division that you have to remember when talking about budgeting, not only for governmental units but almost any units, is you have a major division between capital and service. I remember when I showed you the budget on the wall over there, when we were looking at it to make a request for funds, we had everything put together into personnel and non-personnel. Okay, the personnel is generally your service. Your capital budget is all equipment. Generally that lasts over a year. Your service is your personnel, supplies, and things of that nature. So, when you're doing your budgeting and you place money in your budget for a capital expenditure, that tells you that in all future years, you're going to have an item in your service budget to pay for the continued maintenance of it. Correct? Remember we mentioned this is something that most people overlook. You know, it's nice if your family gives you a car. And boy, are you happy until the first time you got to take it to the gas station and fill the gas tank. And that car is going to cost you forevermore. Insurance, gasoline, oil, tires, brakes. And it's the same way with any capital asset. A building, it's got to be cleaned, it's got to be painted, the roof has got to be fixed when it leaks. The hot water heater only lasts about 10 years, furnace about 30. So any time that you have a piece of capital equipment and you budget for that, but then you also have your service budget, and the service budget generally covers a one-year operation. The capital budget, you know, you have the life of the asset. May all be in the 1 year. You may have to finance it, and then the financing comes down into your service budget, and then you pay for it for the next 10, 20, or 40 years. But you now all know the difference between capital assets and a capital budget and your operating budget or service budget. That's the first thing you need to know. And then we talked about the different types of budgeting into a line item and program budgets. And the line item budgeting is what most people are familiar with and use day after day. The federal government on down, all of your certified public accountants, anybody operating in a cost accounting department, everybody knows what you mean when you say a line item budget. That means there is a line in your budget for every activity. Telephone, postage, gasoline, insurance, the janitorial service, personnel, the personnel perks, your hospitalization insurance, the contribution to the retirement fund, old age survivors insurance, workman's compensation. Everything for which you expend money, there is a line for that item. And that's what people have been using for centuries, and that's what they understand. And we all know how it operates. There's a cycle. You're first asked to prepare your budget. So you always ask for more than what you need in case they trim it back on you. And then after you got the money and you're into the expenditure year, you conserve the money so you don't run out for the first 6 months. Then if you got anything left, you hurry up and spend it at the end of the year so that you can ask for more next year. And that's the way people operate line item budgets. It's not really sensible, but that's the way it goes. So, in order to overcome some of those problems with the line item budget, people have tried to come up with program budgets where you allocate the monies according to a program. And then you keep track of the money spent on the program. Like in our school planning, instead of having a line item budget for faculty salaries, for staff salaries, for the mimeographing or photocopying, and for long distance telephone, and for supplies, we would have 4 items, or 5. We'd have so much money for the BUP program, the MCP program, the Masters of Health Planning Administration, and the Bachelors of Health Services, and the Urban Studies program. So we'd have 5 programs, and we'd have a budget that had 5 figures in them, one amount of dollars for each one of the programs. And this really doesn't work too well, because how are you going to pay the faculty person? I get some money out of each one of these, and who do I have to see to do that, and how do we account for it? And if I devote 60% of my time to one program, and there isn't as much money in that budget as in the other. And so this is a little more difficult to accomplish. This is pretty straightforward, and that's why people generally go back to it and rely upon it. The program budgeting is generally all right if you are producing a product that you can follow, like the cost accounting procedures, like at General Electric. They produce like the J69P engine. And then they can add up all the cost of producing those engines, and they can budget for the production of that engine next year. But even there, they still wind up having a line item budget within the program budget. This became very popular during the Nixon administration, when Secretary McNamara, who came to Ford Motor Company as the Secretary of Defense, and he tried to run the Army like he ran Ford, and they tried to do program budgeting, and they had a program budget for every weapon system, and that got kind of cute. The weapon system is a rifle, and you budget so much money to produce the rifles. They have what they call a program planning and budgeting system, and they had to have a measure of it. And so they had to figure out how many people you killed with that rifle. And that's how they got to the body counts during the Vietnam War, which you probably heard about or you will see in the movies made about the Vietnam-era war. They had to count the bodies so they could report it back to the Pentagon so they could finish the program budgeting process. And so you see it gets to some great extremes. And even here in Cincinnati, they tried it in City Hall. And the Planning Commission had a program budget. And so much was budgeted for zone change requests, and you didn't know how many people were going to request a zone change. And so Herb Stevens ran 2 budgets. He ran his own line item budget inside the department, and everybody in City Hall did. And then they put after about 5 years. However, though, people still keep talking about it, and you'll keep hearing about it. So you should be able to distinguish between those types of budget and budgeting operations. Okay, then we talked at some length about the master plan. And anybody introduced to planning has to be introduced to the master plan. And so remember that there are at least four basic parts of the master plan, and that is population, economics, land use, and transportation. And we project or forecast 20 to 25 years in the future. And what we do is we take each of these four factors, the population, and we generally get a current estimate and then we compare that to some past census, and then we compute the growth, and then we project the future. So here in 1988, we would estimate what is the population of Cincinnati today. We compare it with the population census of, say, 1980, 1970, and from that we could calculate the growth rates. And then we would say, okay, we will now forecast these growth rates as continuing either at the same rate or a lesser rate or an accelerated rate. We would assume that the Back to the City movement has now got a good foothold. Remember, we went through the diffusion of innovation in America, how things change once they get started. So we're going to assume that even more people are going to move back into the city than have been in the past. And so from those past trends, our current estimate, we've computed the growth, and we're going to forecast the future. And then we're going to do the same thing with the economics. We'll look, at the present, and we'll go look at the past. We get the census of business, census of wholesale, census of service, the old book of county patterns, all the publications of the federal government, Census Bureau, Department of Economics, and we compare 2 points in time. We get growth rates, and then we forecast those to the future. And then we can compare and see if we're going to have the same number of people for the number of new jobs we're going to have in the future, or are we going to have enough jobs in the future to handle the population that we're forecasting. Then after we've done that, we'll look at the land use. Remember, we go out in the field and we look at all the structures, and we come up with a pretty map, and then we go back and find where we did it once before, or if we didn't, we go get aerial photos from a time period before, and we check to see what new land uses have come into being. We measure that into acres of residential, commercial, etc. And then we calculate the absorption rates. And we know that for X number of people, we need X numbers of acres of land. And then we do the same thing for the economics. And then we can project the future. Now we know about 25 years in the future, we're going to have more people living in more houses and working in more factories, and they're all going to be located according to the pattern of land use that we have described. And so then we're going to need a new transportation system to hook it all together. And we talked about transportation. You do an O&D study, origin and destination, and then that tells you how much more additional trips you're going to have, and you assign that to the road pattern, and that tells you where you need new roads, and you come up with a future transportation pattern. And that's basically how you do the master plan. And so you ought to be able to at least capture those ideas and put them down on paper. And then I will know that you know it. And it's getting to be about 25 after, and I think we can do the rest of this on Thursday.